I am Bob Lingle, and this is the Good Neighbor Podcast. This is a place where I connect with authors and the community. We use this time to discuss life, sometimes death, but always books. I hope you enjoy our conversation today, and I hope you get something out of it. The world is a pretty confusing place right now, so let's do our best to be good neighbors. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Our guest tonight has been involved in the fight against censorship for 35 years. He is the executive director of the National Coalition Against Censorship and the former president of the American Booksellers Foundation for Free Expression. After working as a newspaper reporter, he studied American history at Columbia University. He is the author of Alfred E. Smith, The Happy Warrior, Drunks, An American History, and From the Palmer Raids to the Patriot Act, A History of the Fight for Free Speech in America. Tonight, we are going to talk about his latest book, How Free Speech Saved Democracy, The Untold History of How the First Amendment Became an Essential Tool for Securing Liberty and Social Justice. Congratulations, Chris. This is the longest title of a book that I have had to introduce. I am also happy to introduce our guest tonight, Christopher Finan. Thanks for joining us tonight, Chris.
Thanks, Bob. I'm glad to be here. And I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry about the title, but you know, it's like I just figured I had to front load it and hope for the best.
Well, it's perfect. It had the title before for the longest title was The Vampire Gideon Suicide Hotline and Halfway House for Orphan Girls. So you have dethroned that one as the longest title, and it's appropriate. Reading through this, I probably drove my wife and kids crazy, my older kids that are 8 and 6, because there was just so many times that I was reading that I just stopped and just read something that I was not aware of and blew my mind and felt like I needed to tell somebody, like, were you aware of this situation in American history? And I have enjoyed all of the author talks that we've done in the past and all of the books that I've read, but I've never had been so energized to and motivated to tell somebody immediately about the book that I'm reading. So thank you for doing that.
Well, that's music to my ears. Obviously, I'm glad it sparked your interest.
So the book is about free speech, and that has been your focus and your passion for 35 years now. We kind of did an overview of your work history, but what first led you to want to work in the space of free speech and censorship?
Well, I guess I should start with the fact that I'm 69 years old. So that while 35, actually almost over this year will be 40 years since I took my first free speech job. And, you know, it has a lot to do with how I grew up. You know, those early years were very important. It happens that my father was a talk radio show host in the 1960s. So I come from a family of big mouths to begin with. And my mom, you know, my mom was on the board of the ACLU of Colorado. So these were issues that, you know, came up frequently as I was growing up. But even more than that, it was the period that I grew up in. You know, I graduated from high school in 1971. So it was a little after the flower child generation, but we had, you know, I grew up watching television, watching the civil rights movement and people being beaten in the streets by police for peacefully protesting. Later, you know, there was the Vietnam War. And again, protesters were punished for opposing the war. There was a lot of censorship of the arts in the 60s, a big battle over obscenity, which may be reemerging again. There were the Pentagon Papers. You know, I grew up wanting to be a part of, you know, that fight. And specifically, by the time I got to college, I wanted to be, Carl Bernstein, or Bob Woodward. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be uncovering government abuse, and then, and that's really only a sample of the protests from the 60s and the 70s. That it was the women's movement. There was the gay rights movement. It was, everybody was fighting repression, and I wanted to be part of it. So I tried journalism for a while, and I worked for a small paper outside of Cleveland for a couple of years. And then I decided that I would go to graduate school for a year. I ended up staying for a PhD because I loved reading about history. And then when I got out, I wasn't really cut out to be a teacher. And I saw a small ad in the New York Times for a part-time coordinator of a free speech group, small free speech group, and it started then. And I've happily been involved in the fight ever since.
And you, one of your more recent books, or one of your past books, is about the Patriot Act and free speech. What prompted you now to do more of a full scope history on the topic of free speech?
Well, I thought the book that book was really about the many important developments in protecting free speech that began with World War I, and it's a very dramatic story in its own right. But I wanted to go all the way back and really put free speech in context, because we all grow up in this country believing that we have the First Amendment, so we've always had free speech. The truth is quite the opposite. There was at least a century of extreme suppression of radical ideas, even liberal ideas. And the only way for movements for rights, workers' rights, women's rights, an end to slavery was to go against the grain of American society and take the consequences, which were often violent and landed you either a punch in the face or in jail, or so that I thought it was really important to tell that preliminary story for people to really understand what it was like before we understood why free speech is so important, and why it's so important to protect it.
That is a really good point, and I think that's why, because of the time period that we're in now, I got so excited when I was reading this book, because I think that anyone who is involved with libraries and school boards, what is going on with Virginia right now, where it's up to the state legislator and waiting on the ruling of a judge to determine if 2 books are going to be banned or extremely limited, not just in public, not just in libraries and schools, but by private booksellers and independent bookstores. And I think it's very important to understand the history that is going into this. You had kind of begun the book with the Sedition Act of 1798. And that was the first moment where I have talked to so many people of like, I feel like I was aware of this. But if you can kind of give an overview of what that was and the early impact of that on free speech.
Yeah, I think it really strongly demonstrates how undeveloped and primitive the concept of free speech was at the time, because the First Amendment was adopted in 1791, and only 8 years later, men who had actually, been part of the approval of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, understood so little about what they had done that they actively suppressed efforts to criticize the Adams administration over its conduct toward a potential war with France, and it was it was a brutal suppression of speech. It was an attack on editors, more than 100 editors and others, for merely criticizing the government. And if that's not basic purpose of free speech, nothing is. But Benjamin Franklin actually said we had no idea what we were. I mean, they knew as a theoretical concept, but they didn't really understand how it would work. How it would actually work in real life. And what happened was, in response to that suppression, there was a counter reaction led by the Jeffersonians, who were the target of the attack, to wipe the slate clean. And there began to be an understanding of the danger that government could pose to free speech, even in America. Unfortunately, it was only the first of many examples of government overstepping its authority, as I was just talking about earlier, in so many ways, in their response to other protests.
And just want to take a moment for anyone that's watching. If you have any questions or comments, you can feel free to use the comment feature if you're using Facebook or YouTube, and we will try to incorporate those questions or comments in as we can. Getting into the abolitionist movement, one of the things, there's so much that we can talk about, so I'm just trying to narrow the scope. I just want everybody to read the book. But the use of the post office throughout quite a few of these movements was just something that I didn't even think about, that I wasn't even aware of. So if you can kind of talk about the use of the post office, and then this is, and how it kind of ties into the Comstock Act of 1873 with the suppression of how people were trying to make a movement, specifically with the abolitionists.
So the abolitionists, in the beginning, and really throughout the whole period of controversy over slavery, were very small group, right? They were in almost every place in America. They were a small minority of people who were really yanking on the tail of the tiger. Most Americans either supported slavery or accepted it, as a necessary part of the economy of the country. And so that the abolitionists had this problem of how to get their message out, and to really make people aware of how terrible slavery was, particularly people in the North. And what they did was they actually they moved out, and they traveled, on foot and in other conveyances from town to town, giving speeches or trying to give speeches. They were often attacked during the course of those speeches. But what they did that so rattled the slave owners in the South and supporters of slavery was they created this immense paper propaganda campaign. And using the latest technology, the printing press had been invented centuries ago, but new steam presses, expanded the ability for not a lot of money, to produce all kinds of articles of information about slavery for all kinds of people, for men, for women, for kids, and they inundated the country with this propaganda. And the immediate reaction of the South was to try to suppress those mailings. They were pretty much successful in terms of what came to the South, but they couldn't do anything about the North, even though they demanded that the government suppress this as a threat to public safety in the South. The fear of slave revolts, was a real one for them. And So it's really the beginning of the attempt to use the post office as a tool for suppression. After the war, when slavery, had been abolished, a guy by the name of Anthony Comstock realized the power of the post office to suppress ideas that he disapproved of, and he persuaded Congress to enact the first federal censorship bill, which became called the Comstock Act, and gave government the power to ban so-called obscenity from the mail. And there was obscenity. There was actually explicit material in the 1870s and 1880s, but it went far beyond that and was used as a tool to suppress any information about contraception and to, in general, to enforce a very puritanical view of sex on the country. And any radicals, and there were radical advocates of sexual equality who crossed paths with Comstock, ended up in jail. So the post office has been central to the free speech fight right up into the 20th century, when postal inspectors seized Ulysses, and and the trial of Ulysses took place and was finally held to be not obscene. But that was the 1930s.
Mm-hmm. Emily, who is actually a bookseller that's involved in the fight in Virginia, she has a petition that's going on right now. If you had, depending on what you're watching this on, I have a link to that petition in our link tree if you're on our Instagram page. But if you wanted to share a link to that petition, please do so. I think, Chris, you answered a bit of her question of, she's curious how tactics were used to fight censorship before the digital age, any strategies that have died out. I feel like the post office has kind of lost prevalence in the way people use it. I want to talk more about the social media and internet a little bit later. One thing I wanted to highlight, because I was moved by the story of Elijah Lovejoy. If you can talk about what happened with him during the abolitionist movement.
So Elijah Lovejoy was the first free speech martyr in the United States, but not the last. He started out as an editor of a religious paper. He wasn't particularly interested in slavery, but he began to speak out against it, and was forced to leave his original home and to move to Illinois, Southern Illinois, where he hoped he would have the freedom to write about these issues. But Southern Illinois had a lot of people from the South who were strongly supportive of slavery, and told him to either shut up or risk the consequences. And the consequences involved the destruction of 3 of his presses. Each time they were broken up, he would bring a new one in. And when he brought the 4th press in, he was determined to defend it, and a group of friends supported him, and a gun battle broke out, and Lovejoy was killed. They basically stepped over his body and walked into the warehouse where the press was kept, and destroyed it there and threw its parts into the Mississippi River. It was a national outrage, but it was still quite early. I mean, this was the 1830s, and the fight had to continue.
And you had mentioned that the fight against slavery provided an entry into the political role to women for the women's movement, the suffragist movement. Can you kind of explain how those two became connected?
Yeah, it it's a very moving story in its own right, because it took so much courage for the women who first began to speak up against slavery to do so. It was generally accepted that that was not a woman's place. Women weren't smart enough and they weren't strong enough. And it indeed was, it took a lot of courage for them to begin to speak first to women only, then to mixed audiences, and then eventually to stand up in state legislatures and denounce slavery. They became the army of people who helped carry petitions from house to house, petitioning the federal government to ban slavery in Washington, D.C., where there were still slave markets. And that created this enormous paper avalanche on Washington, D.C., which again, there were members of the government who tried to, and for a number of years successfully managed to resist accepting these petitions, even though the right to petition was also protected in the First Amendment. And they went on from there. They went from fighting for abolition to fighting for their own rights in 1848. First enunciating a demand for the vote, and then they would have to fight for almost another 70 years before they finally won that. And in the course of that, many women suffered for protesting, and right up until the end, when they were actually picketing the White House, something that had never been done before. And after a couple of years of being tolerated, they started throwing those women in jail. And the leader of that protest, Alice Paul, was among some women who were actually engaged in hunger strike and were force-fed as a result. So it's a great story. And of course, it continues on from there right through the 1960s and the 70s and up to today. And the Women's March in 2020, and now, the protests over the likely repeal of Roe.
Because I enjoy history, but I don't read enough of it, and I feel like this book may be the catalyst for me to change that. So I was so hesitant to talk to some people because I'm like, does everyone know this? Am I the only one that's not aware of these things? But to read through this and read other books, to develop an understanding of history, you develop such an appreciation for where we are now as a country and the issues that we're facing, the struggle that women still have to be in a place of power in politics or otherwise, to be able to read through it in this of the early stages of when that shift happened, to see the progress, but also to see how far they still have to go. It's encouraging and frustrating at the same time. I want to talk a bit about the influence of war on free speech. You talked about it several times throughout the book, from World War II right through the Patriot Act. I don't know if you wanted to talk about a specific element of it or an overview of how war has historically created opportunities for the government to suppress free speech.
Well, sure. I think it's very important. It's a very important subject because the greatest threats to free speech have always occurred during war. And from the Civil War, from the Alien and Sedition Acts, which was a wartime measure, right up until today, it continues because it continues to be such a threat because national security, is so essential, and appeals to national security have so often been used as justification for punishing speech. But it really came to a head during World War I, in response to America's entry into World War I. It was not a universally popular step, although Congress was united, but there were big constituencies in the country. There were German Americans, first and second generation German Americans, who weren't sympathetic. The Irish didn't want to see anything happen, didn't want any help extended to England in their fight against the Germans. The socialists thought it was a capitalist war. There was a significant amount of criticism, and the response to that was the passage of laws that created draconian penalties for simply criticizing the war. And more than 2,000 Americans were arrested for things like circulating petitions, writing letters, either to politicians or to newspapers, simply for criticizing the war. And it was that naked exercise of power over the most basic question of government policy, whether or not we go to war, that made it a group of lawyers realize that it wasn't enough to proclaim loyalty or support for free speech in peacetime, but of all times it needs to be protected during time of war. And those were the kind of prototypical civil libertarians who came together in 1920 and founded ACLU, to be a steady source of support for free speech, no matter what the circumstances. So we've had, and in every war since then, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, there have been efforts to suppress people who were critical of the government.
Do you feel, because one of the things that, a takeaway that I had from this is that and it's a common phrase of like, we're not learning from history. If you don't learn from history, then you'll end up repeating it. Do you feel as if with each war, we have learned something from the past as a society, or do the targets just change? Instead of rounding up Russians, we round up Japanese. Instead of rounding up Japanese, we're rounding up people from the Middle East. Do you feel that it's gotten better in any sensible way?
There's no question. There's no question. It has gotten better, and there were fewer violations of civil liberties during World War II, which was partly because the country was much more unified behind that fight. But it's also a result of what I talk. There's a chapter in the book about the free speech revolution, which occurs in the 1950s and the 1960s, and it's a response to the effort to suppress the civil rights movement. The Supreme Court begins to decide very important cases that establish precedents protecting free speech in almost all circumstances. And so even though people were punished, Julian Bond was denied a seat in the Georgia legislature because of his opposition to the war. A guy got thrown into jail for wearing a jacket that said "fuck the draft." Construction workers attacked demonstrators. Even though those things happened, government, in any case, government, the Supreme Court protected those rights of protest when government was involved, and so we are far more protected. And when the Patriot Act was passed, and we felt like the Patriot Act overstepped in some regards that the powers given to the government threatened the right of privacy and others, we were able to appeal to those precedents in building support for our efforts to, get changes in the Patriot Act. So, we're a much freer country today than we were in 1920.
I'm going to be asking a couple questions that will try to either restore or just give me some optimism for our current state. So we're doing good so far. I'm putting a lot of weight on your shoulders for that. But as a bookseller, and then I sit on the board of our local library, I would like to spend some time talking about what's going on with our current situation and the different aspects of it. I found it really interesting that librarians and booksellers have become such fighters now and have been for quite a while, but it wasn't always the case that librarians and booksellers were on the right side of censorship, where they used to sit on committees, and that it was Arthur Proctor at an American Bookseller Association conference that was the one to stand up and say that we need to just give people books and not be the censors of them. Can you talk a bit about before that change in how booksellers and librarians acted it as those gatekeepers?
So before the 1920s, before Arthur Proctor got up and said we should give people the books they want, not the books we think they should have, there was a concept that the role of publishers and booksellers and librarians was to ennoble their patrons, to raise their level, to encourage their devotion to Christian values, and uphold a high culture. And what happened in the 1920s was a bunch of authors said, screw this, we're going to start writing about the world as it actually is. We're going to write about poverty. We're going to write about sex. We're going to write about the world in a realistic manner. And when they did that, it set off a tremendous censorship counterattack that kind of was symbolized by the fight in Boston against so-called obscenity, and the term "banned in Boston," was minted, and it was publishers, not all publishers, and it was booksellers and not all booksellers. It was a minority movement at first to support this idea that it isn't the job of those people to tell people what's right and what's wrong. It's to give them the tools to decide for themselves what's right and wrong, and that often means giving them books that the larger community rejects. And so their job actually becomes not advocating for one particular concept of culture, but protecting the right of people to make those decisions themselves. And it's a role they started to embrace in the 20s, and that has grown over the years and manifested itself, is manifesting itself now in the response to the efforts to censor books about sex and books about race that are under attack in schools and in libraries. And it's not a great place to be, because you get called a lot of real bad names, and people that used to talk to you stop talking to you, or even if it's just to avoid putting themselves in bad odor with others. It's a very difficult thing to stand up at a school board meeting and say this is wrong, and it's hard to say before a library board. But it is what they're doing, and it is what gives me optimism. I actually believe, as bad as things are, we've seen this before. We saw it in the 80s. There was also a similar flood of challenges to books, and by pushing back against it, by founding in those years the Banned Books Week as a way of building public support for books. That we were able to withstand the tide and push it back. It'll happen again. It's just at this point we're a little back on our heels because the fight now is being pushed by politicians in a way that it never has been to date.
Because you had referenced the schools and libraries with the state of Virginia. What's your thought on what's going on there, and would you have any advice for a bookseller that may be watching right now, and how to push back on the censorship that's going on now?
Well, this attempt to have genderqueer declared obscene in Virginia is going to fail. There's no question that genderqueer is not obscene. Whether or not it should be in the schools or not, the fact is that many school districts have embraced the book, consider it of enormous value and of appeal to many of their students, have resisted, have perhaps withdrawn the book temporarily and put it back on their shelves. So this effort by politicians to do an end run around what local people may decide and get a court to declare the books obscene. No book has been declared obscene in this country for 70 years. That's too far back. 50 years. 50 years. Not since Tropic of Cancer in the 1950s have there been courts that have ruled. And the Supreme Court took those cases and said, you're wrong. This book does not fit the definition of obscenity. States do have the right to ban obscene material, but they have to abide by a very narrow definition that the Supreme Court approved. And that means it has to overall be prurient material, and it has to lack serious value, literary, political, scientific value. It's a very tough test, and that's the reason why. So this is just political grandstanding in Virginia. Mm-hmm. But it has the impact. It could have the potential effect of chilling, making some schools, some librarians reluctant to exercise and support the rights of their readers, just because it's a frightening thing to stand up to, to the advocates of censorship, when they're at their height of their fury.
And I'm going to ask your opinion, but your educated opinion. If it were to pass in Virginia, but then obviously get appealed with our current state of the Supreme Court, are you at all concerned that they would go along with the censorship of that particular book or any?
I don't think so. You can't say with 100% because there hasn't been an obscenity, but in previous cases, involving even child pornography and efforts to, suppress child pornography by passing broad definitions of the term, conservative justices have joined with the liberals to push back because they recognize the danger of a chilling effect, and to make it very narrow for child pornography, it has to be actual depictions of minors involved in sexual conduct. And why is that? That's a criminal act that's being displayed, and the court has declared that the harm there is so clear that it justifies a further exception to First Amendment. The Justice Anthony Kennedy, the justice who wrote one of those decisions, is a libertarian, and I think we don't need to fear that right now, but there are also signs. Some of those justices will support things or have indicated they don't like the decision in Sullivan versus New York Times, which has established protections for the press that are so critical, and not just the press, but for all Americans. They'd like to narrow it. So, there will be conflict over these, but at this point, it's hard to see how they would so far recede from the precedents that they. But having said that, of course, that just raises the issue of how seriously do they take their precedents. They never say never, but I'm hopeful that the current precedents protecting free speech will stand.
But in the interim, would you suggest that we continue to make noise about it?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the next step for all of us, in this fight is to speak up and be heard, and that's beginning to happen. The American Library Association has launched a national campaign called Unite Against Book Bans. The Texas Library Association has established a local coalition of groups to push back. We're working with other defenders in some of the most active states, Florida, to rally support, because the fact is that as the ALA showed in a recent poll, 70% of Americans are opposed to book bans. So what we have to do is we have to rally our supporters and make ourselves heard, and I think if we do, we will win in the end. The question is how long is that?
Yeah.
And that's an open question, but you have to fight. I mean, the lesson of my book, I think, is that if we don't fight for free speech, we won't have it. And you just can't assume that because it's in the Constitution that it's going to be there when you need it. You have to be able to fight the battles that present themselves.
You had referenced the ACLU and their push for defending free speech in all terms, up to and including the KKK. They came to the Ku Klux Klan's defense in terms of being allowed to disseminate their information, propaganda. On the note of defending free speech in all aspects, it's not the same because it's not, bookstores aren't government institutions, but I'm curious to see what your thoughts are, because it's been an internal conversation to a certain extent. It's gone out a little bit more publicly. The difference between bookstores of censorship and curation based on the books that they're going to bring into the store and what they're willing to order for a customer. Do you have any sort of thoughts about the conversation that's been going on for, it's been close to a couple of years now, or like the last year and a half? Any guidance or advice? You had worked with the American Booksellers Association for quite a while, so I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, well, there's a generational issue that's affecting all cultural institutions in this country, and publishing and bookselling and librarianship are all affected by this. That young people who have never really experienced censorship and who have an understandable interest in advancing equality, both by sexual identity and by race, and that their focus has been on those fights. That's the fight of their generation, and some of those people, some of those booksellers, publishers, librarians, have actually advocated for not government censorship, but they've advocated for censorship within their institutions. And it's understandable, but it's wrong. It's wrong-headed. And I think that what we're seeing today that's happening in Florida and Texas really demonstrates, I hope they understand that what's happening in Florida and Texas is classic censorship by government. And that is by far a greater danger to their values as well. I mean, the books that are being attacked in Florida and Texas and other places are books about the importance of realistic appraisals of racism and the role of slavery in American life and sexual identity. These are the books that these young progressives have helped publish and sell, and they are important books. But they are in danger of being suppressed by people who have real power, have the power to do this. I mean, Virginia may not play out. I don't think it's going to amount to anything. But there are all kinds of ways in which government can lean on schools and libraries, which they fund, to suppress ideas that they don't like. And that is the ultimate lesson, I think, of the fight for free speech, is that we have to unite around the importance of protecting the rights of others, of people that we don't agree with, even when they say hateful things. We don't have to like it. In fact, on the contrary, we should fight it ourselves by pushing back against it with words. But the effort to suppress what other people say, that's just a mistake, and it's been shown, time and again in our history. So my hope is actually that progressives will join with kind of us traditional defenders of free speech in these fights and take home the lesson that it's fine, it's laudable to fight for the things that they're fighting for, but censorship shouldn't be a tool in that fight.
Thank you. The one other aspect that I wanted to get into was, and we've talked about it, but just specifically for teachers, my wife is an educator now, and just some of the things that I ran and shared with her after I read them, that the push against teachers and the concern that teachers are indoctrinating their students is not a new thing. Going back to like the 1920s, there was concerns that they were indoctrinating students against American values. The American Legion published their own couple-volume textbook on American history, and it's just one of those cyclical things that we've already discussed. And we don't even have to get into it further, because I just wanted to specifically address that the issues that booksellers are dealing with is not new. The issues that teachers are dealing with are not new. And it's just to continue to stress the importance that it's very important to know your history, because it can provide you with the tools to fight against what's going on now, if you see how they fought against it 100 years ago. I went on my own soapbox there rather than asking you a question, but I feel like you had already addressed it a couple of times. But before we get into the conclusion of the book and my push for a hope for optimism, the difference now where the post office was one of the main tools to disseminate information, now we have the internet. Obviously, that has changed things in so many ways. How has that, in your opinion, how has that changed for the better? And what are some of the complications that have arisen from that?
Well, the internet is challenge created the internet created tremendous opportunity and tremendous challenges, and it was the opportunity for anyone to speak and find an audience. But it turns out that a lot of those people who want to speak and the audience that they found are people who believe falsehoods and people who are motivated by hate. And the question of how to deal with with misinformation and hate speech is a very critical problem. We were a little, the people who embraced, absolute free speech in the beginning were a little naive about the nature of the country and the power of the medium. And in the interim, over the years, the social media platforms had, most of the biggest ones had embraced the importance of content moderation, of not letting things, pointing out when misinformation takes place, of actually eliminating posts that are threatening, and it's far from a perfect system. And we actually have our own fight with the internet platforms about artistic nudity, their complete ban on all nudity, and which affects so much art. But it's an effort that I think has had some success and that needs to continue. Where we kind of draw the line is in believing that government censorship is not the way to address this problem, and and we currently are supporting an opposition to a Texas law introduced by conservative politicians that would force social media companies to would deny them the right to engage in content moderation. That's an exercise of government power, which we think goes far too far. That social media companies, like bookstores and bookstores, have First Amendment rights, and those need to be protected. But certainly, it's very painful to see, the things that to see hate speech, and but our fundamental belief is that the way to respond to hate speech is with more speech. This is the kind of the classic libertarian response to ideas that we don't like. You got to fight them, and we're entirely supportive of that. So it's a difficult problem. There's no doubt about it.
There's one question from the viewer, Stephen Daniels. Do you believe there's a line between censorship and age appropriate?
Yeah, we do. We don't think that every effort to every challenge to a book is necessarily mean-spirited or censorious. Our concern, though, is that age appropriateness is often used as a cover for an effort to simply suppress a particular type of content. But the great innovation of the 1980s that led to a significant reduction in censorship was the adoption of policies, formal review policies. Before those existed, it really fell to a principal or or a school superintendent to make a decision about whether a challenged book should be removed or not. Now most school districts have policies that require the convening of a committee to decide whether the book is appropriate or not, and whether it's in the right grade. It's in the right grade or not. And if a committee composed of a librarian and a parent and sometimes a student or some kind of media resource officer, if they decide that a book should be reshelved, we we would not criticize that necessarily. We would not criticize that. That's a a policy that has been followed, and but a lot of this is being fought not in an effort to regrade material, but to remove it altogether, and that we are going to oppose.
So you state in the conclusion of the book that the United States is far more democratic country today than it was 200 years ago. Do you feel that the ongoing tension that we just kind of feel and see through the news and social media each day is a product of that democracy of ideas, I guess?
Yeah, it's democracy has never been anything but contentious, and it's for that very reason that we have to protect free speech, because it's that conflict that helps us decide where the country is going to go, how policies are going to be, what policies we're going to adopt, and what future we're going to have. It's painful. It involves a lot of protest and counter-protest, but in a democracy, how else do we determine truth? This was Oliver Wendell Holmes's point in 1919 when he gives his famous dissent. There isn't anybody that we can turn to who knows the truth and be trusted, to make decisions for us. We have to make these decisions ourselves, and that was his. Came up with this idea of a marketplace where ideas could be debated and decided. And it's not perfect by any means, but it's the best. It's the best solution that anybody has come up with so far for how a democracy moves forward.
I think we're approaching our hour at a very good time, because I forgot to mention at the beginning there was calls for severe thunderstorms, and I hear those rolling in. So I was worried I was going to lose power at some point during this. You had mentioned something about social media that made me. Outside of this, I just like to plug this. It's like a 5 or 6 episode podcast that came out 2 or 3 years ago called Rabbit Hole. Put together by Kevin Roos, who's a contributing tech writer for the New York Times. And it does a deep dive into YouTube algorithms. And it's just a fascinating look into, it examines one person who just started watching YouTube videos and then clicked on enough videos and got steered down a rabbit hole where he was just radicalized, and then was able to work his way out of that because he realized what had happened to him. Really interesting podcast. It's Rabbit Hole. But back to your book. We have copies of the book in stock. How Free Speech Saved Democracy, The Untold History of How the First Amendment Became an Essential Tool for Securing Liberty and Social Justice. It's also available through our bookshop page. If you're not local to the area, I also encourage you to pop into your local independent bookstore and tell them to get the book on their shelves. Chris, is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up this evening?
No. I can recommend. I want to recommend a book too.
Yeah.
For those of you who want to explore more the whole issue of hate speech, including arguments against government responses, Nadine Strawson, the longtime president of ACLU and a recently retired law professor, wrote a short little book called Hate, and it is for me it's a major resource of argument in this area on both sides. I mean, she gives both sides their due, and And I think, you know, you get a fuller understanding of the libertarian point of view on social media from Nadine's book. So I heartily recommend. But buy mine first, please.
Yes, absolutely. We may have an event come up in a couple of weeks. We're still working on the schedule for that. But the next event that we do have scheduled is another book from Steerforth Press called I Can Take It From Here by Lisa Forbes. We'll be talking with Lisa on Wednesday, June 29th at 7 p.m. Lisa was an abusive relationship, so abusive that she ended up murdering her spouse. She went to prison for that. She did her time. She came out and entered into the world and realized the struggles that she was going to have because of having that on her resume, as it were. And she ended up starting a company that connects ex-convicts with companies that are willing to hire them. So this book is her story of her relationship, her time in prison, and then overcoming the trauma of all of that to land on her feet and help those that have gone through a similar situation. So it's looking forward to that discussion. That's Wednesday, June 29th at 7 p.m. Thank you again, Chris. Your book is available in the store and on Bookshop, and tell everyone to read it because it's very eye-opening. Thank you so much for everyone watching tonight, and thank you again, Chris.
Thank you, Bob.